What's going on, everyone? Welcome, and I want to talk about something real interesting, and it's based around the idea of ownership. Okay, for those who don't know, who are unfamiliar, Hasbro, the toy company, has purchased Death Row Records. I'm gonna say it again because I know it sounds weird. It sounds weird to me even saying it out my mouth. Hasbro, the toy company, has purchased Death Row Records. For those who are familiar with Hasbro but not familiar with Death Row Records, I'll explain. In the early to mid 90s, going into the late 90s, in hip hop, there was a record company called Death Row Records, run and operated by Suge Knight. You may remember some of their more famous artists, Snoop Dogg and Tupac Shakur. Okay? They were very huge and prominent in music, not just hip hop, but in music during the early to mid 90s. Over time, they defected and split up. Legal issues, I ain't gonna get into all that. But Death Row Records is no more, especially not the level they were then. And for those who are familiar with Death Row Records and not familiar with Hasbro, let me explain that. Hasbro is a toy company, as I said before. It makes toys. It makes toys for any company. It's made toys like what's it called, the Infinity Gauntlet for Avengers and Infinity Wars. The Infinity Gauntlet. It made that. Made stuff for Power Rangers, stuff like that. You see the toys all over the place. Hasbro is 9 times out of 10 the company that made the toys. Okay? Well, like most companies, and this is also a good lesson in ownership. Okay? Ownership and diversity. Two very powerful words. Ownership and diversity. When it comes to business, any company can own any other company, whether or not the companies have anything to do with each other. Okay? Hasbro and Death Row Records are opposites. They own opposite ends of the spectrum in terms of business. One deals with music, the other deals with toys. Okay? One deals with kid toys, the other deals with adult music. Okay? Totally, the worlds shouldn't even cross. However, in business, the bottom line is the bottom line. And if a company like Hasbro found a way or has the money to buy Death Row Records, and I'm going to assume Death Row Records and all of its property, that's business. It sounds crazy. As crazy as it sounds, it's still business. And the gist of it is, all businesses need money to maintain itself. Okay? That's just a basic rule. You need money to run things. Okay? Without any money, you're unable to run your business. Now, in the heyday of Death Row Records, it was powerful. But unfortunately, it is not as powerful as it once was. And I guess because of this, it doesn't have it's not able to generate the amount of money needed to keep itself running. So what happens is a company who, wants to expand their businesses saw an opportunity to buy a company. Now, you would think, well, if Death Row Records isn't doing as well as it once was, how come Hasbro brought it? Well, because when it comes to music, the real power comes in the ownership of the masters and the publishing. Meaning, when you own the idea or the music in terms of music, that's really where the power and the money comes from, because you are able to now take that music and license it out to whoever you want. Okay? So if you own the rights to the music, that's just more money coming to you. That's why a lot of musicians now always stress the fact of owning your masters and owning your publishing. You always hear that. You hear that talk now. Own your masters, own your publishing. Because if someone else owns your masters and owns your publishing and all the properties therein, they now have the power to do with that intellectual property as they see fit. So any music or any intellectual property that is under Death Row Records now belongs to Hasbro. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, Death Row Records owns Tupac Shakur's music, his intellectual property. Let's say he never owned it himself. Let's say the company owns it, okay? And he never got his intellectual property back. What that means is, when Hasbro bought Death Row Records, they also bought Tupac Shakur's music, meaning they own Tupac Shakur's music. That's what that means. If Snoop Dogg didn't own any of his music and Death Row owned it, that means that when Hasbro bought Death Row Records, they also bought Snoop Dogg's music. They own Snoop Dogg's music. I think Snoop Dogg owns his music. I think he owns his catalog. But any catalog or intellectual property that belong to Death Row Records, right? If it's under them and and Death Row Records own that intellectual property, the moment Hasbro bought Death Row Records, they end up owning the intellectual property. So that shows a very, very powerful, and really I don't hear a lot of talk about it. There's a lot of talk about other things, but I don't hear talk about that, because that's major. Because you would think, okay, well, Hasbro makes toys. What would Hasbro, a toy making company, want with music? Right? Why? Like, why would you want that? Well, you would say, okay, you can just own it for the sake of owning it. Or, let's just say Hasbro makes a new toy, right? They make a new toy and they want to put it on commercials and promote it. Don't be surprised if you hear music from Death Row. Okay? Let's say they got a new toy coming out, they want to put on commercials, and you hear in the background music, you hear a Death Row song. Right? And you think, wait a minute, why do I hear a Death Row song on a toy commercial? That's because Hasbro owns the intellectual property of Death Row Records. Right? That's what that means. And if anybody wants to use any intellectual property from Death Row Records, they now have to go to Hasbro. In the world, this little boy. They now have to go to Hasbro and ask Hasbro, hey, can we license your music or your intellectual property for our product? That's what that means. So that means that anybody that was under Death Row Records that didn't find a way to maintain ownership of their intellectual property, they no longer see that money. Because if Death Row owned their intellectual property and Hasbro owns Death Row, that means that Hasbro owns the intellectual property. So then you got to ask the question, well, who under Death Row Records was able to get their intellectual property back and own it outright? Who were they? Because now they don't got to worry about that. The ones who intellectual property was under Death Row Records and still under Death Row Records and they never got it back, they, if I'm understanding correctly, they don't receive either, they won't receive any money, they won't receive as much money as they normally could or should had they owned their own intellectual property outright. You see that? So now, don't be surprised. Like I said, I don't see a lot of people talking about this, but this is something that needs to be talked about. Because we talk about ownership, we talk about owning your intellectual property, especially as artists of all sorts. The power in owning your own intellectual property. Anything you say, anything you do, your image, all of that, your likeness, all of that goes into intellectual property. All right, what you write down, any footage of you that's from you, that goes into intellectual property. Your ideas and your likeness. If you don't own any of that and someone else does, that means that they can use your intellectual property to make money basically off of you, and you receive none of the benefits of creating the intellectual property. Okay? So Hasbro owning Death Row Records is really, really big. And people really need to understand that dynamic. A toy company owning music is not new. It's not new at all. But just the concept. A toy company for children owning adult content music. Peep that logic. A kids toy making company owning adult content music. Think about that. Think about that. All right? Look at that dynamic and see how it all plays out. See now you see the real power of ownership. Okay? Pay attention to that. I just wanted to talk about that because I don't see many people talking about it, but I think it's something that needs to be spoken about. And hopefully you can learn a lesson from this and really think about what's going on. All right? Catch you all later. Peace.